Rain had worked through the seams of Rebecca Fraser's mantle before the market lamps were fully lit, and the wet wool clung to her shoulders with a steady, punishing weight while she pushed between barrows of onions and crates of river fish, both hands locked around a parcel of ivory satin she was under strict instruction not to drop. Mud sucked at her half-soled shoes with each step. Cold water slipped through the thin leather and spread around her toes until she could no longer tell where skin ended and damp cloth began. She kept walking. Porters shouted. A cartwheel struck a rut and sent a filthy water over her skirt hem. She did not flinch because the parcel must remain dry, because Lady Whitcomb had said so, and Lady Whitcomb's commands arrived with penalties attached. The bells of St. Bride's had not yet rung 5. Smoke from the first cook fires hung low over Fleet Street and caught in Rebecca's throat. Hunger sharpened every smell into a torment. Hot bread somewhere to her left, coffee farther on, a butcher trimming fat behind a stall, the knife rhythm clean and unhurried. She had eaten yesterday at noon a crust and weak tea in the servants' passage, then nothing after she failed to finish hemming 6 dinner napkins before midnight. Her fingers still carried the sting of lye from the laundry copper and the puncture pain of a broken needle driven into the side of her thumb. She shifted the wedding gown higher against her chest so the wrapped bodice would not brush the place where the skin had split. The motion pulled at her ribs. The borrowed corset beneath her plain day dress had already left a band of ache across her back. It had been laced for someone narrower, someone fed. She moved anyway, dark hair loosening under the bonnet strings, pale face half hidden by rain, large eyes fixed on the narrow line of road ahead, as if attention alone might hold the morning together. A flower seller saw the satin parcel and stared too long, then glanced up and down Rebecca's wet sleeves with open curiosity. 2 gentlemen under one umbrella slowed when they passed, not enough to stop, enough to look. She heard one murmur, low and careless, "That is Fraser's girl, is it not? The plain one." His companion answered, "A titled girl carrying bundles at dawn. Whitcomb Economies." The words landed exactly where unkind words always landed, between throat and breastbone, a place already crowded with too much. Rebecca kept her mouth closed. Her teeth struck once from cold. She pressed her tongue to the back of them until the shaking eased. At Ludgate Hill, a groom trying to calm a nervous bay mare gave her space without being asked, and touched 2 fingers to his cap, not in respect, but in recognition. The look men gave housemaids and errand girls who moved before daylight. She had grown used to that look. It had followed her for 4 years through markets, through apothecaries, through stationers where she purchased ink for Lady Whitcomb's invitations, and then copied names she would never receive from anyone herself. A fishwife with red hands and a kinder face than most called, "Mind your step, miss," as Rebecca nearly went down on the slick stones beside a gutter runnel. Rebecca nodded and did not answer. Speaking made room for feeling, and she could not afford either. Rain collected on her lashes. She blinked it away. The parcel shifted again. Beneath the wrapping, the silk was too fine to belong to her life, heavy and smooth and expensive enough to buy coal for an entire court through winter. She knew because she had kept those accounts once, before the ledgers were taken from her desk and locked in Lady Whitcomb's escritoire. Now she kept only the household drudgery list in her head. Ash pans at dawn, kitchen flagstones, silver to polish, guest rooms to air, curtains to beat, seams to mend, candle stubs to collect and remelt, and every task done quickly enough that she could be sent for the next humiliation while still out of breath from the first. By the first week of November, the routine had become a harness she wore from waking until sleep. No fire in her attic room, unless Lady Whitcomb entertained and wished the upper hall to smell less like cold stone. No breakfast unless the drawing-room carpet showed not one loose thread under morning light. No access to her father's books unless she completed whatever public errand Lady Whitcomb found amusing that day. It was always phrased as discipline, as correction, as preparation for usefulness in marriage. It was punishment, plain and constant. Her father had once built embankments and funded river improvements along the lower tenant lands when spring floodwaters cut through 2 villages in one season. He had called it duty and paid for it with loans he did not live to clear. After fever took him, debt came through the door with polite expressions and inked demands. Lady Whitcomb had stepped into his name as if stepping into a carriage, then redirected rooms, rents and titles toward her own daughters with the calm efficiency of a woman selecting ribbons. Rebecca's dowry, recorded in a hand she recognised from childhood, dissolved into a ledger line marked household debt. The townhouse on Harrow Street, once her father's pride, changed function without changing walls. Guests came, candles burned late, musicians played while she carried trays through doorways where she had read by the window as a child. Men toasted prudent management. Women praised Lady Whitcomb's sacrifices. Someone laughed one night and asked whether Miss Fraser had always been so quiet. Lady Whitcomb answered, smiling over porcelain, "She is useful when occupied." Rebecca had stood behind her chair and held the wine decanter steady until her wrist cramped. She had learned the difficult art of swallowing words whole. Anger warmed for one moment, then passed, leaving only the familiar hollow behind the ribs and the old, hard determination not to break where anyone could see it. At the edge of Covent Garden, a footman in Whitcomb livery waited under the awning of a print shop, with rain bright on his shoulders. He looked at Rebecca, then at the parcel, and stepped into her path, so she had to stop in the flow of traffic while strangers moved around them. "You are late, Miss Rebecca." He did not lower his voice. He did not need to. "Her ladyship says the modiste is to alter the bridal gown before noon. You are to stand there until it is done and bring back the scraps. Every scrap." He handed her a folded paper sealed in green wax and added, "And you are to answer, if asked, that the cloth was bought new for you." Her exact words. Rebecca felt heat rise under the cold, a brief flush of shame and fury together. Bought new for you. The lie was almost elegant. She could feel the gaze of 2 passing seamstresses who had heard him and understood at once. One of them looked away quickly, embarrassed for her. The other looked longer, as if trying to decide whether pity was an insult she had the right to offer. Rebecca broke the seal and read. 4 lines, sharp and slanted in Lady Whitcomb's hand. "Deliver gown to Madame Bellier. Wait, do not speak unless spoken to. Return directly." She folded the paper once, twice, set it inside her sleeve and said, "I heard you." The footman gave a small shrug, the kind that carried borrowed power like perfume. "Then move, miss. Her ladyship is at breakfast." Hunger twisted in Rebecca's stomach so hard she had to shift her weight. At breakfast, eggs, kidneys, hot tea, marmalade, toast. She pictured the sideboard in precise detail because she had laid it herself before dawn. White damask cloth, silver warmed near the stove so Lady Whitcomb's fingers would not touch cold metal. Her stepsisters laughing over the notice of her upcoming marriage, as if the event were an entertainment arranged for their season. They had asked whether widowers preferred obedient wives because dead ones did not argue. Lady Whitcomb had corrected them gently. "The Duke of Ashmore prefers convenience." Rebecca had continued placing plates, as if she were deaf. She crossed Bow Street with carriages spraying water from the wheels. and turned into the narrower lane where Madame Bellier kept her rooms above a milliner's shop. The lane smelled of wet stone, starch, and horse. A churchyard wall ran along one side, dark with rain and moss. She climbed the outer steps carefully because the right shoe had begun to separate at the sole, and each rise sent a strip of cold through the stocking to her instep. At the landing she paused, not from hesitation, but to steady her breathing before she entered yet another room where she did not belong. Through the glazed door she could see movement, lamps lit, assistants in pale aprons carrying lengths of lace over their arms, a mannequin near the far wall draped in pearl silk. Her reflection in the wet glass looked like someone sketched in ink and water, all angles and dark lines, face too thin, eyes too large. Plain, people said, because they had no use for the kind of beauty that survives neglect. She adjusted her grip on the parcel and wiped rain from her upper lip with the back of her wrist. The split skin on her fingers burned where the damp reached it. She thought of the attic room waiting tonight without coal. She thought of her father's books locked behind a cabinet door she could open only when permitted. She thought of a marriage arranged to settle numbers in ledgers she had not been allowed to read. The Duke of Ashmore was a name in newspapers and whispers, a widower with an empty seat at his table and enough land to alter the weather of entire villages. She was 22, hungry, cold, and carrying a gown cut for a life she had never chosen. Inside, someone laughed. The sound floated through the seam of the door and vanished into rain. Rebecca lifted her hand and knocked. The latch turned after a delay long enough to remind her of rank, and an apprentice with pins between her lips opened the door only as far as her body allowed, looked once at Rebecca's wet hem, then at the parcel, and stepped aside without welcome. Warmth struck her face first, then lamplight, then the layered scent of steam, beeswax, and damp silk hung too close to the ceiling. Madame Bellier's rooms were crowded with mannequins and half-dressed clients, with mirrors that doubled every movement and made narrow spaces seem full of watching eyes. Rebecca crossed the threshold and felt mud from her shoe mark the boards where no mud ought to be. She stopped near the side table and offered the parcel with both hands. From Lady Whitcomb, for immediate alteration. The apprentice took it with care given to cloth, not to her, and called into the inner room, "The Fraser bride's gown has come." Laughter from behind a curtain fell quiet at once. A woman in pearl grey turned her head and looked Rebecca over from bonnet brim to soaked cuffs, then looked away with practised indifference. Rebecca stood where she had been left, water cooling against her skin, fingers throbbing in time with her pulse. She drew Lady Whitcomb's note from her sleeve when asked and watched Madame Bellier break the seal, read, and fold it into a narrow line between gloved fingers. The modiste's expression did not shift. "You will wait." Her accent softened the order but did not weaken it. "There are prior appointments." Rebecca inclined her head. "Yes, madame." She knew what waiting meant in houses like this. It meant standing in plain sight while women discussed other women's fortunes as if they were trims to be chosen and replaced. It meant hearing her own name spoken in the third person while she was near enough to touch the speaker's sleeve. It meant carrying the weight of her father's decisions in a room where no one had known his voice. She took her place by the window and kept her hands folded low, the split skin hidden. Beyond the glass, rain veiled the lane and churchyard stones. Inside, silk hissed over polished wood, scissors clicked, girls hurried with armfuls of lace, and Rebecca held still as if stillness itself were a form of payment she could make toward debts she had never incurred. She had learned that art the year after her father died, when condolences lasted 10 days, and collection notices lasted forever. He had gone to bed with fever and risen once to ask for tenant maps, then never rose again. Men came with hats in hand and sorrow in their mouths, and by week's end they came again with ledgers and terms. Lady Whitcomb had worn black crape and a face of patient devotion. She had sat beside the solicitor, accepted each paper, and spoken of stewardship. Rebecca, barely 18, had stood at the escritoire where she once copied embankment figures for her father and watched the columns change under another hand. Deferred became due. Reserved became transferred. Dowry became household expense. Within a fortnight, the key to the library passed from Rebecca's chatelaine to Lady Whitcomb's reticule. Within a month, the room itself was recast as a morning sitting room for callers. The Atlas cabinet pushed aside to make space for a pianoforte. One stepsister could barely play, and the other played loudly. Grief had no private corner after that. It shared space with upholstery decisions and luncheon cards. A seamstress beckoned at last, not for fitting yet, but to unfasten Rebecca's mantle and shake water from it over a basin by the stove. "Hold still," she muttered, already turning away before the words were done. Rebecca obeyed. Pins flashed in quick hands around her shoulders where the day dress had stretched. Another apprentice crouched at the torn sole of her shoe and gave a short, incredulous breath that might have been pity or contempt. "How are we to place a hem against that?" she whispered to no one who would answer. Madame Bellier replied from across the room without looking up. "With skill, Miss Ada. We are paid for skill." Paid! Rebecca almost smiled at that. Not from amusement, but from recognition of a language she understood better than any of them guessed. She could still see numbers as shapes behind her eyes. Her father had taught her to balance accounts before she bled, had sat her at his right hand in the old study with a ruler and a blunt pencil, and said that a figure was a promise written in ink. He had trusted her with tenant rents, seed orders, grain tallies after poor harvests, and the annual repair schedule for sluice gates along the lower river. She knew to the penny what the spring floods had cost, and why he borrowed against future yields to reinforce embankments no landlord of sense would leave to chance. He had not speculated. He had protected families who could not absorb one more ruined season. Debt followed duty, as winter follows dusk. The fever followed debt. Lady Whitcomb followed both. She had arrived years earlier with lavender at her wrists, and 2 daughters in soft muslin, all smiles at first, all graciousness, while father still lived to praise Rebecca's handwriting in front of guests. After his burial, the smiles remained, and the ground shifted beneath every footstep in the house. Breakfast became privilege, fire became reward, books became leverage. If Rebecca rose before dawn to blacken grates and haul coal, a tray might appear at noon. If one spoon showed water spots, the tray did not appear at all. If she answered too quickly, Lady Whitcomb called her ungrateful. If she answered too slowly, Lady Whitcomb called her stupid. The daughters learned the pattern quickly and improved upon it. Eleanor Whitcomb took Rebecca's mother's cameo brooch because it suited blue silk. Jane Whitcomb took the small dressing table from Rebecca's bedchamber because her own mirror did not flatter candlelight. Between them, they emptied drawers that had once held ribbons, letters, and a silver-backed brush set engraved with F, then laughed when Rebecca stood silent beside the open cabinet and asked whether she meant to cry over trinkets. She had not cried. Her throat had closed, her palms had gone cold, and she had folded empty linen paper around air, as if objects still sat where they had always sat. Later they took space instead of things. First her larger room facing Harrow Street, then the smaller one at the back, then the right to sit in the breakfast parlour unless summoned. At 20, she was moved to the attic under the eaves where frost climbed the inside of the panes by December. At 21, the key to the schoolroom cabinet went the same way as the library key. Lady Whitcomb kept the books locked and issued them as if issuing medicine. 1 volume for 3 days if tasks were complete. None if they were not. Rebecca read by candle stubs when she could, lips moving silently over Milton and account law, over sermons and maps, over anything with ordered lines that reminded her the world could still be measured even when it was unjust. By the second week of November, even the servants had ceased to react when Lady Whitcomb called for her by given name in front of visitors, and sent her into rain with parcels too fine for her hands. They watched, they lowered their eyes, and they made room in corridors so she could pass with trays and baskets, while guests discussed her future at full volume. She heard every version of it, the useful arrangement, the fortunate rescue, the sensible disposal of a burdensome daughter. The widowed Duke of Ashmore, they said, required a wife who would not challenge him, and Lady Whitcomb had one readily to hand. Rebecca had carried Crystal through drawing-rooms, while women in satin debated whether plainness in a bride was an advantage, as if beauty were a vice and hunger a character flaw. She had stood behind a chair and listened while Lady Whitcomb explained that Rebecca possessed gratitude in place of charm. That line had drawn soft laughter, then approval. Gratitude for what? For being bartered to settle old columns, for being told the contract would preserve the house when the house no longer contained anything of hers beyond memory and labour, for the borrowed gown now hanging in Madame Bellier's inner room, too narrow at the ribs because it had been cut for another body and altered overnight for hers. She had not been permitted to ask whose body first. She had been told only to stand straight, breathe less, and remember that disobedience had consequences for everyone dependent on Whitcomb wages. The cruelty was never wild. That was what made it enduring. It came as household management, as prudence, as correction administered with a level voice and a bell pull. Rebecca learned to carry commands in silence because refusal would not harm Lady Whitcomb first. It would harm Cook and Tom in the stables, and Martha, who had once slipped Rebecca half a heel of bread at midnight and later lost 2 weeks' wages for carelessness no one could name. So Rebecca obeyed and stored details like evidence she could not yet present. Which creditor had called? Which paper disappeared from the escritoire? Which jeweller's invoice had been copied twice with mismatched sums? She remembered dates, initials, ink colours, ribbon seals. Her private dignity had narrowed to this: she would not let truth vanish simply because no one asked for it. "Miss Fraser," Madame Bellier's voice cut cleanly through the room. "Come." Rebecca crossed to the raised fitting stand while 2 apprentices lifted the ivory satin from its wrappings and let the skirt spill in a pale, heavy circle at her feet. Up close, the bodice smelled faintly of starch and old rose water. Someone had worked all night at the seams. Fine stitches. Tight work. Work done in haste and secrecy could still be skillful. Rebecca placed one hand on the post for balance as the first layer settled against her shoulders, as laces drew in at her back, as the pressure at her ribs sharpened from ache to pain. Around her, women moved with swift, impersonal competence. Pins touched skin. Chalk marked side seams. A tape brushed her throat. Madame Bellier stepped close, narrowed her eyes at the bodice line, and pressed her thumb along the inner edge near Rebecca's left side, where the satin doubled over whalebone. Rebecca flinched at the sudden bite beneath the lining, small and hard and wrong, as if metal had been hidden where no metal belonged. She turned her head toward the seam, breath caught high in her chest, and said before caution could stop her, "There is something in the bodice." Madame Bellier's hand stilled on the seam at once. The room, which a moment earlier had moved like a clockwork of pins and silk and measured murmurs, seemed to catch on one tooth and halt. Rebecca kept her palm on the fitting post because the pressure of the laces had made her breath shallow, and the hard point inside the bodice had shifted again, sharper now that she had spoken it aloud. Madame Bellier pressed once more cautiously, then frowned for the first time that morning. "Where?" she asked. Rebecca swallowed. "Left side, just under the bone." Miss Ada stepped closer with a seam ripper already in hand, but Madame Bellier took it from her and said, "No, I will do it." The apprentices drew nearer anyway. Curiosity outran discipline in every workroom Rebecca had ever known. One girl held a lamp low. Another gathered the skirt so the satin did not drag. Rebecca stood in the centre of them, with her dark hair damp at the temples, with her split thumb reopened by the earlier pinning, with the borrowed gown tight enough to make each breath feel stolen. She watched the modiste slide the point under the inner stitches. Tiny threads lifted, the lining parted by degrees. A narrow channel opened between whalebone and satin. Then the tool struck metal with a dry, unmistakable click. No one spoke for 3 heartbeats. Rain tapped the window glass. A carriage rolled past below, wheels hissing through water. Madame Bellier set the seam ripper aside and reached into the slit with 2 gloved fingers, careful as a surgeon. She drew out first a strip of black ribbon, old and frayed at one edge, then the weight tied to it. The stone caught lamplight even through grime and years, deep blue, cut in an older style, surrounded by tiny seed pearls gone faint with wear. Miss Ada made a sound under her breath. "Not loud enough." "Oh, merciful God," whispered the woman in pearl grey at the mirror. The words travelled through the room faster than any command. Clara, Bellamy, Morning Ring. The names came in fragments, in half-spoken certainty, in the brittle excitement of people who understood scandal before they understood facts. Rebecca looked down at the object resting in Madame Bellier's glove and felt the floor tilt beneath her. She had never seen Lady Clara Bellamy alive, but she had seen her likeness engraved in society sheets sold for a penny at street corners. Pale throat, calm mouth, a sapphire at her hand in one print, called in the caption a token from Ashmore before the fever took her. The same size, the same dark fire at the centre. "That is not possible," said the client in pearl grey. Yet she did not look as if she doubted it. "It was in the seam," Rebecca said. Her voice emerged thin from the laced corset and the sudden crush of watching faces. "I felt it cut me." Madame Bellier turned the ring over with her thumb, exposing the underside of the band. Inside, even through wear, a tiny inscription showed in cramped script, "CB" with a date. Someone near the back gave a small gasp and covered her mouth. Miss Ada stared at Rebecca as if she had produced a pistol from the altar Bible. "How came that into your gown?" "No one gave it to me," Rebecca said. She heard her own pulse in her ears. "I have never seen it before this moment." The room did not believe or disbelieve. It calculated. Who would gain? Who would be ruined? How quickly the story might outrun the rain and reach breakfast tables in Mayfair before noon. Rebecca felt every gaze as a physical touch. She stood in a wedding gown she had not chosen, in shoes with wet stockings inside them, with blood rising bright along the old split in her thumb and beading against ivory satin while strangers measured whether she looked guilty. From the stair below came a heavy tread, then another. Not the quick, light steps of apprentices. A man's boots, wet and unhesitating, mounting fast. The outer door opened without knock. Cold air moved through the fitting rooms in a single sweep, carrying rain and street grit and the scent of wool soaked through. "Your Grace, you cannot—" the apprentice at the entrance began. He did not answer her. He crossed the threshold into lamplight, and conversation died so completely that Rebecca heard the drip from his coat hem onto the boards. He was taller than she had imagined from newspaper caricatures. Broad through the shoulders, dark hair rain-plastered at the temples, jaw set hard enough to look carved. His greatcoat was unbuttoned, black cloth heavy with water. A white cravat showed at the throat, rain-spotted. One glove remained on his left hand. The right was bare and reddened by cold. His eyes moved once across the room and stopped on the ring in Madame Bellier's glove, then on Rebecca on the fitting stand, pinned and half-laced and bleeding into bridal satin. No one had introduced him, yet everyone stepped back as if a command had been spoken. The Duke of Ashmore had the kind of presence that made space rearrange itself. Rebecca had been warned he was reserved. She had not been warned that reserve in a powerful man could feel like the edge of a blade. Madame Bellier lowered her hand. "Your Grace, there has been an error in the lining." His gaze did not leave Rebecca. "Who gave you that?" The question landed like an accusation before she could draw a full breath. Her throat tightened. She forced the words out anyway. "No one gave it. It was sewn into the dress." He took one step closer. Rain slipped from the ends of his hair onto his collar. "By whom?" "I do not know." "Liar," said the woman in pearl grey, too quickly, then flinched when his head turned fractionally toward her. He did not raise his voice. "Out!" The single word sent 3 apprentices scrambling at once. Pins were gathered in shaking hands. A client snatched her mantle and nearly dropped it. Miss Ada stood rooted until Madame Bellier seized her elbow and pulled her toward the curtain. In the space of 20 seconds the room thinned from crowded to bare, leaving only lamplight, damp air, Madame Bellier near the table, and Rebecca still on the stand with the bodice half open, and the Duke watching her as if the next sentence could alter the course of both their lives. Within the same rain-soaked hour that had begun with measurements and hems, safety vanished and rank took its place. Ashmore extended his bare hand to Madame Bellier. "Give it to me." The modiste hesitated a fraction, then laid the ribbon and ring into his palm. He closed his fingers around it and looked down once, briefly, the way one might look at a wound to confirm it was real. When he looked up again, whatever had moved across his face was gone. "Miss Fraser," he said. The title was correct. The tone was not kind. "Step down." Rebecca braced one hand on the post and descended from the fitting stand carefully, because her knees had begun to shake from tight lacing and cold, and the force of being seen at her worst by a man who could end her with a single statement. She stood on the boards in soaked stockings, the skirt pooled too wide around her feet, the torn seam gaping at her left side. "Look at me," he said. She did. His eyes were the colour of winter water under cloud. There was anger there, but not the kind she knew from Lady Whitcomb, not spite sharpened for pleasure. This was controlled, dangerous because it was controlled. "Did Lady Whitcomb send you with this in your possession?" "No." "Did you know it was in the gown?" "No." "Did anyone instruct you to produce it in public?" "No, Your Grace." He watched her long enough that the silence hurt. At last he said, "Hold out your hand." She obeyed before she could ask why. He took her left hand, turning it palm up. His fingers were cold from rain. His grip was firm, impersonal. He inspected the split skin at the thumb where blood had marked the satin. You are injured? Only from needlework, from this seam, and from other seams. The words escaped before caution could stop them. His eyes lifted to hers at once. Rebecca felt heat rush to her face, less from shame than from the old reflex that followed any unguarded truth. Lady Whitcomb would have called it impertinence. Ashmore only looked at her as if adding a new fact to an internal ledger. "Who laced you?" he asked. "Madame Bellier's staff." "Too tightly." "It is a borrowed gown." He glanced at the bodice, at the strained seams, at the old stains near the inner lining, now visible where it had been opened. "I can see that!" Madame Bellier drew in breath as if to defend her work. He spoke before she could. "You will lower the laces now." "Your Grace," the modiste said carefully, "we are not yet at final fitting." "You are now." She moved at once, fingers fast at the back ties. Pressure eased from Rebecca's ribs in increments. Air reached the bottom of her lungs for the first time in what felt like hours. She did not sway, though black points had begun to gather at the edges of her vision. She would not faint in front of him. She would not give anyone that story to carry downstairs. Ashmore opened his fist and studied the ring again. The black ribbon dangled over his knuckles, dark against his skin. He spoke without looking up. "Lady Clara Bellamy wore this on the day we announced our betrothal." Rebecca held still. Everyone in London knew the outline. Betrothal, illness, funeral in rain. A duke who did not remarry for years. He continued, each word clipped. "It was buried among her effects after her death." Madame Bellier spoke from behind Rebecca, voice unsteady for the first time. "Your Grace, I swear upon my trade I did not place it there." He turned his head slightly. "You will produce your work ledgers, every entry for this gown, every hand that touched it." "Yes, Your Grace." He looked back to Rebecca. "You will come with me." The command struck so hard she almost stepped back. She did not. "To where?" "Ashmore House first, then Whitcomb Residence." Her stomach tightened. My lady did not grant permission. His mouth changed by a degree, not quite a smile, nothing warm in it. "I did not ask, Lady Whitcomb." He released her hand and crossed to the door in 2 strides. He opened it and called to someone below, voice carrying cleanly down the stairwell. "Bring the carriage round immediately. 2 footmen, no delay." A male voice answered from the street. "Yes, Your Grace." Rebecca heard the rain more clearly then, harder against the window pane, as if weather itself pressed closer to witness. She said carefully, "If I leave without instruction, she will dismiss Martha and Tom to punish me." He looked at her, and for the first time the anger in his face shifted towards something colder and more precise. "She will do nothing," he said. "Not today." He returned to her and held out his gloved hand, not in invitation, but as one offers support to a witness expected to stand in court. "Take that shawl," he said to Madame Bellier without turning. "Cover her. No one sees her on that street dressed half-pinned." The modiste snatched a wool wrap from a chair and placed it around Rebecca's shoulders. The rough warmth against her wet skin felt almost painful. Ashmore's gaze dropped once more to the torn seam at her side. "Do not touch that lining again." "I was not planning to." "You will do as I say, Miss Fraser." She lifted her chin, despite the tremor she could not wholly hide. "If I am to answer for this, I will answer fully. I will not repeat any lie." Something in his expression stilled. His hand, still open between them, did not withdraw. "Good," he said at last. "Then begin now. In the carriage you will tell me every instruction Lady Whitcomb gave you from dawn." The words landed with the weight of judgment and of protection at once. Rebecca could not yet tell which would prevail. She placed her fingers in his offered hand because there was no safe path left that did not pass through him, and because beneath the command she heard, for one brief and disorienting instant, need. She placed her fingers in his offered hand because refusal had narrowed to theatre, and theatre was a luxury hunger had long since stripped from her. His grip was steady as he guided her down the narrow stair, one step, then the next, past apprentices pressed to the walls with lowered eyes. Rain drove through the open door in silver lines. The carriage waited at an angle in the lane, lamps blurred by weather, 2 Ashmore footmen already at the wheels. He did not speak until the door shut behind them, and the city sound dropped to a muffled roar. Then he sat opposite her, knees nearly touching through wet wool and satin, and braced one gloved hand on the strap above as the carriage lurched forward. "Begin," he said, "from dawn." Rebecca gathered the shawl tighter over the torn bodice and forced her breathing into an even rhythm. "Lady Whitcomb ordered me to carry the gown to Madame Bellier before 5. She sent a footman to meet me at Covent Garden and deliver a written instruction that I was to stand until alterations were complete and collect every scrap of discarded cloth." His gaze did not leave her face. "And the lie!" She looked down at her bleeding thumb, then back at him. "If asked, I was to state the cloth had been bought new for me." Her exact words? "Yes, Your Grace." The carriage hit a rut. She caught herself against the seat frame. He did not move to help her. The restraint felt deliberate, as if he were refusing any gesture that might blur rank before facts were clear. "What else?" "She said I was not to speak unless spoken to." He watched her in silence for 3 breaths. "You speak clearly now." "There is less to lose now." A muscle in his jaw tightened. "Do not decide that yet." She almost answered that decision had been made for her years ago, in ledgers and signatures and rooms reassigned, but she held it back. She had already given him one unguarded sentence and seen how sharply he took measurements of a person. Rain hammered the carriage roof. Streets narrowed and opened again. They passed under an arch where sound deepened, then turned toward wider avenues where the wheels ran smoother over better stone. Through the blurred glass she glimpsed a row of facades with white columns and dark ironwork, London's money washed clean by servants before first light, while poorer streets still ran with grit. By the time they reached Ashmore House, the sky had lifted from black to leaden grey, and water streamed from lion-headed gutters at either side of the steps. Footmen met the carriage before it stopped fully. One held an umbrella over the Duke. None offered one to Rebecca until he said, without turning, "Cover her!" Inside, warmth rose from hidden grates. Marble swallowed the sound of wet shoes. She followed him through a hall hung with ancestral portraits and into a long gallery where daylight filtered through high windows and turned every gilt frame pale. At the far end, on a wall given more space than any other, hung Lady Clara Bellamy. Rebecca had expected prettiness, made grand by oil and varnish. The portrait was not that. It was serene and severe at once, a woman with calm dark eyes and a mouth that looked as if laughter had once come easily and then cost too much. One hand rested on the arm of a chair. A sapphire ring glimmered at the second finger, unmistakable even at distance. Ashmore stopped beneath it. He held the recovered ring wrapped now in clean linen, black ribbon folded inside. He did not look at the portrait at first. He looked at the object in his palm with the stillness of a man walking a narrow edge. "Do you know this room?" he asked. "No, Your Grace." "Good. Then nothing in it can teach you a story to repeat." The line struck her as almost cruel. Then she understood it was aimed elsewhere, at prior scripts and coached statements, and the machinery of polite deception that had governed every room she had entered since her father's death. He turned to the butler waiting discreetly by the door. "Mr. Hale, send a rider to Whitcomb Residence. Inform Lady Whitcomb I require access to all dress accounts, jewellery receipts, and household ledgers for the past 6 months. She is to prepare them before we arrive." Mr. Hale inclined his head. "At once, Your Grace." "And send word to Barrister Kett. He is to meet me at noon." "Yes, Your Grace." The butler withdrew. Ashmore faced Rebecca again. "You heard." "I did. If any person asks what was found in that gown, you will answer with the truth and no embroidery." She lifted her chin. "I have no gift for embroidery outside cloth." His mouth shifted by a degree, not warmth, not mockery, something between recognition and warning. "Do not mistake me for an ally yet, Miss Fraser." "I do not mistake you for anything. I barely know you." The words hung between them. He regarded her for a long moment, eyes hard, then moved toward the door. "Come," he said, "we will test whether your Lady Whitcomb knows as little as she claims." The return to Harrow Street felt shorter and sharper, as if the city itself had drawn taut. The rain had eased to a fine cold mist that settled on skin and never seemed to dry. At Whitcomb Residence the knocker fell before they reached the top step. A maid opened with visible alarm, then dipped into a curtsy so quick it was nearly a stumble. Her gaze flicked to Rebecca's half-mended bodice beneath the shawl and away again. Lady Whitcomb received them in the small blue drawing-room, not the formal salon. She had chosen speed over display, then corrected for display in her own manner. Lilac silk, pearls at the throat, lavender scent preceding her by a half-second as she crossed to greet the Duke. "Your Grace," she said, voice sweet and smooth. "What an honour at such an hour! Had we known—" "You were told," he said. A pause, only one heartbeat, but Rebecca heard it. "Indeed, such urgency. I confess I was distressed to hear there had been confusion at the fitting. Poor Rebecca has always been prone to nerves." He did not offer hand or smile. "Where are the ledgers?" Lady Whitcomb spread one hand toward a side table where 3 account books and a leather folio had been stacked with performative neatness. "Here, naturally. You will find nothing irregular." His glance skimmed the pile and returned to her face. "I expect to find accuracy. Irregularity is a different matter." He signalled to one of his footmen, who stepped forward and gathered the books. Lady Whitcomb's expression did not crack, but colour drained slightly from the powder at her temples. "Rebecca," she said, turning with maternal concern sharpened to a point, "you are shivering. Come, child. We should have you changed while His Grace reviews these tedious figures." Ashmore spoke before Rebecca could answer. "She remains with me." Lady Whitcomb gave a low laugh, as if indulging male overprotectiveness. "As you wish, Your Grace. Still she looks quite undone. I should hate for gossip to turn unkind." "Gossip has already done that work," he said. Silence fell. Lady Whitcomb recovered first, as she always did. "Then perhaps we should all assist one another in limiting further mischief. There are ladies in my music-room who heard dreadful fragments. A simple clarification from Rebecca would settle matters before luncheon." His gaze moved to Rebecca. "What clarification?" Lady Whitcomb answered for her. "Only that the ring, if ring there was, came into household custody years ago by innocent means. Clara Bellamy was charitable. She gave trinkets to staff often. One hardly keeps track of every ribbon tied to sentiment." Rebecca felt the lie before she could pass the words. It had the practised ease of something prepared in advance. Lady Whitcomb had built an exit already, a narrative where dead generosity explained living deceit. Ashmore's face did not change. "Miss Fraser can speak for herself." Lady Whitcomb's smile held. "Of course. Rebecca, tell His Grace what I explained last winter, when old jewel boxes were sorted. Lady Clara's maids sent effects for distribution. There was no concealment, only confusion." Rebecca stared at her stepmother and saw with sudden clarity the architecture beneath years of casual cruelty. Never strike when a suggestion can bruise deeper, never accuse directly when pity can do the work, never forge a document where a coached witness will suffice. She could speak the line. It would be easy. One sentence and the floor might steady beneath her feet. One sentence and Martha might keep wages, Tom might keep his stall, and she might pass through this day without being called liar by 2 houses instead of 1. Lady Whitcomb took a small step closer. In any other room it would have looked like affection. In this one it felt like a hand at the back of the neck. "Rebecca," she murmured, too low for the servants at the door, "do not be foolish. We are all trying to preserve your place." Preserve your place. The phrase settled like ash in Rebecca's mouth. She thought of her father's library key taken from her palm, of breakfast withheld as correction, of her name used in public as warning and entertainment, of Clara Bellamy, dead and unable to defend her own memory, while others repurposed it for convenience. She thought of the ring hidden in whalebone where it could wound and accuse at once, and of the women at the modistes who had looked at Rebecca as if guilt was stitched into her skin. When she answered, her voice was quiet. It carried anyway. "Lady Clara gave me nothing. I never met her." Lady Whitcomb's fingers tightened around her fan. "Child!" "The ring was sewn into my wedding bodice this morning or the night before. Not years ago in a jewel box. I felt the metal cut me when I was laced." Lady Whitcomb's eyes flashed, then softened instantly for the Duke's benefit. "Your Grace, she is overstrained. She has always had dramatic notions when frightened." Rebecca kept her gaze on her stepmother, not on Ashmore, because this was the part that mattered. "If she tells you I was instructed to repeat a different account, that is true. I was." A stillness moved through the room, dense as storm pressure. One of the maids at the threshold lowered her eyes to the carpet. The footman holding the ledgers stood so rigid his knuckles whitened against leather. Lady Whitcomb's voice lost its silk edge. "You ungrateful girl! Do you understand what you are risking?" "Yes." "Do you understand what will happen to this household if you indulge this fantasy?" "It is not fantasy. It is insolence." Rebecca felt the old tremor run through her hands and held them still by force. "No, it is record." Lady Whitcomb's fan snapped shut. "Record from whom? You who cannot keep a hem dry in rain." From somewhere behind, Rebecca came the soft scrape of a boot against floorboard. She had forgotten Ashmore's exact position in the room. She had been speaking into one face only, into the source of years. She did not turn. Lady Whitcomb took one more step forward, voice now barely above a whisper, every syllable sharpened. "Retract this, now! Say you were mistaken and I may still salvage what remains of your reputation." Rebecca swallowed once. Her throat burned. "My reputation was spent before breakfast and spent by others. I will not spend the dead woman's with it." The words landed, and only then did she hear Ashmore move. 2 measured strides. Then his voice, close enough that she felt it along her spine before she fully understood the words. "Mrs. Whitcomb!" Lady Whitcomb froze. She had not been addressed as Mrs. in this house for years. He stepped into Rebecca's line of sight and came to a stop between them, not touching either, broad shoulders closing the space with cold finality. His face gave nothing away except attention, a dangerous amount of it. "You will repeat your account," he said, looking first at Lady Whitcomb, then at Rebecca. Separately, under written statement, Mr. Hale will witness. Barrister Kett will examine. Lady Whitcomb's composure fractured for the first time. Your Grace, this is absurd. A domestic misunderstanding elevated to legal theatre. He held her gaze. A ring buried with a dead woman was hidden in my fiancé's wedding dress. That is not domestic. She drew breath to protest again. He lifted one hand and the room obeyed the gesture before he spoke. To the music room, he said to his footman. No one leaves this house until statements are taken. Rebecca felt then what she had not allowed herself to feel while speaking, the delayed shake after danger. It started at her ribs, where the bodice still pinched and moved outward through her arms. She pressed her palms against the rough wool of the shawl to steady them. Ashmore turned slightly toward her without softening his tone. You will sit, you will have your thumb bandaged, then you will write every instruction given to you today, in order with times. Lady Whitcomb gave a disbelieving laugh. She is barely educated enough for a shopping list. Rebecca answered before caution could intervene. I kept my father's river ledgers at 16. Lady Whitcomb's eyes cut to her like glass. Ashmore did not look surprised. That unsettled Rebecca more than anger would have done. Then keep mine now, he said. A housemaid appeared with linen and a small basin, summoned by someone Rebecca had not seen. The maid knelt to tend Rebecca's thumb with hands that trembled less than Rebecca's own. No one spoke while the cloth wrapped twice around the split skin and tied. 3 days earlier, in this same room, Rebecca had stood by the tea table while Lady Whitcomb discussed guest lists above her head as if she were furniture. Now servants watched her as if her words might alter their wages, their references, their next year of life. The weight of that settled hard, but she did not look away. When the bandage was secure, Ashmore gestured toward the escritoire by the window. Right. Rebecca crossed to it, each step measured under the drag of wet skirt and the ache in her back. She sat. The pen was poor quality, the nib too blunt, the ink thin. She adjusted pressure until the line steadied. Date first, hour approximate. Instruction 1, Instruction 2. The lie she was told to repeat. The footman's words in Covent Garden. Lady Whitcomb's exact phrasing from the note. She wrote as she had been taught, clear and spare. No flourish where plain fact would hold. Halfway down the second page she sensed, rather than saw, that she was no longer unobserved from across the room. She kept writing anyway. The scratch of pen against paper grew louder than rain. When she finished, she blotted the page and rose to hand it over. Ashmore took the statement, read the first lines in silence, and looked up at her with an expression she could not yet name. Not gentleness, not approval. Something colder and steadier, like a decision arriving. At the doorway to the music room, Lady Whitcomb waited between 2 footmen. Lilac silk, perfectly arranged, eyes bright with contained fury. She met Rebecca's gaze as Mr. Hale opened the door for written examination. The Duke folded Rebecca's statement once and spoke without raising his voice. Miss Fraser's account stands first in the record. The sentence settled over the room like a seal pressed into wax. Mr. Hale inclined his head once and motioned toward the long table in the music room. Chairs had been drawn to opposite ends, far enough apart that no one could claim influence, near enough that every word carried. Rain ticked softly at the tall windows now. The storm had spent its force, leaving a grey dampness over Harrow Street and a light that flattened every face. Lady Whitcomb crossed the threshold with her spine straight and her fan closed like a blade in her hand. Rebecca followed under the weight of wet satin and rough wool, her bandaged thumb throbbing in time with her heartbeat. The room smelled of lavender water, extinguished candles, and paper newly unfolded. Ashmore did not take the central chair. He remained standing at the table's long side, one gloved hand resting near the ledgers, the other holding the folded statement Rebecca had written. He looked first to Mr. Hale. "Mark the hour," then to the footman at the door. "No interruption," then, at last, to Lady Whitcomb. "You will speak plainly. Dates, names, sums. If you do not recall, you will say so. If you fabricate, it will be tested against ink." Lady Whitcomb offered a strained smile. "Your Grace speaks as if I am a criminal." "I speak as if facts exist." He nodded toward the chair opposite Mr. Hale. She sat with controlled grace, silk whispering against wood. Rebecca remained near the mantel until Ashmore turned his head slightly and said, without looking at her, "Sit where you can breathe." It was a command. It was also a concession to the tight bodice and the tremor she had failed to hide. She took the smaller chair near the window. From there she could see Ashmore in profile, hard line of jaw, rain-damp hair dark against his collar, face unreadable except for the small movement at his temple when Lady Whitcomb began to speak. The ring was part of a mixed lot sent from the Bellamy household after Lady Clara's effects were dispersed. I purchased several trinkets for charitable redistribution. It appears one piece was misplaced. From whom purchased? A broker in Mayfair. I do not remember his name. Date? Approximately 2 years past. Receipt. Lady Whitcomb spread one hand. Who retains receipts for trifles over years? Ashmore tapped the top ledger with one finger. You retain duplicate milk accounts from March. You retain ribbon tallies to half a yard. You retain everything that can be used to extract compliance from your household. Yet this one receipt vanished. Colour rose under her powder. Your Grace mistakes household management for malice. He opened the leather folio and withdrew a narrow invoice slip. Rebecca recognised Lady Whitcomb's hand at once in the endorsement line. He placed the slip before Mr. Hale. "Bellier invoice," he said, "dated this morning. Emergency internal alteration, left bodice channel, private instruction received." "Explain private instruction." Lady Whitcomb's eyes flicked to the paper, then away. "A note regarding fit. The girl is thin." "Private instruction to alter fit is not written as private instruction." His voice remained level. "Who delivered the note?" "I sent a maid." "Name?" She hesitated. "Edith." Mr. Hale's pen scratched across paper. Ashmore turned to the door. "Send for Edith." The footman left at once. Rebecca felt the room tighten. The old dynamic was breaking in pieces she could hear. Lady Whitcomb, who had ruled by deciding what could be said and by whom, had been forced into the one discipline she despised, sequence. Ashmore lifted Rebecca's statement from the table and read one line aloud. "Footman met me at Covent Garden, instructed me to claim cloth bought new for me." He placed the page down carefully. "Your footman's name." Lady Whitcomb's fan snapped open and shut once. "There are 6 on rotation. Must I inventory my staff because an overexcited girl panicked at a fitting?" "Name." She held his gaze. "Pritchard." He nodded to Mr. Hale, then to another servant in the doorway. "Bring Pritchard." When the door closed again, silence pressed in. Rebecca could hear faintly someone moving in the front hall, the muted clink of tack from the mews beyond the yard, the pen still travelling across Mr. Hale's page. Ashmore did not move from his position at the table. He looked down once at the ring where it lay wrapped in linen near his hand, then covered it with his palm, as if the sight of it in that room was a contamination he would control by force. Edith arrived first, a narrow-shouldered maid with red knuckles and frightened eyes. She curtsied so low she nearly lost balance. Ashmore asked only 3 questions. Did Lady Whitcomb send written instruction to the modiste this morning? Yes. Did Edith see the words? No. Did Lady Whitcomb describe the instruction aloud? She said the left side was to remain closed until Miss Fraser stood before witnesses. The maid's voice shook on the final words. Lady Whitcomb turned toward her with a look Rebecca knew too well, a look that promised consequences later. Ashmore saw it and said, "You will look at me when answers are given." Lady Whitcomb's gaze snapped back as if pulled by wire. Pritchard entered next. He kept his eyes fixed above shoulder height at the portrait over the pianoforte, anywhere but the faces. Under questioning, he confirmed he had delivered the message at Covent Garden and repeated the exact phrasing. If asked, say, "Cloth bought new for you." Lady Whitcomb's composure thinned to a bright, brittle edge. "Servants, miss, here," she said sharply. "They embroider to please power." Ashmore's expression did not change. "So does desperate nobility." The words cut the air cleanly. Rebecca saw the impact before she fully understood it. Lady Whitcomb went still, fan frozen halfway open. He had stripped title from her in substance, if not form. In front of witnesses, in her own house. Nothing in that could be recalled by polite correction later. Mr. Hale cleared his throat softly. "Your Grace, shall I append the maids' and footmen's statements to Miss Fraser's record?" "You shall." Ashmore kept his eyes on Lady Whitcomb, and mark that both were warned by glance while speaking. Lady Whitcomb laughed then, a thin sound with no mirth in it. "Warned by glance, we are now prosecuting expressions." "We are documenting pressure," he said. "You understand pressure well." Rebecca had thought she knew the limits of humiliation. She had not seen this inversion before. The same room, the same chairs, the same woman in lilac silk, and power no longer flowing in one direction. It did not feel triumphant. It felt dangerous. Her stomach clenched hard with hunger and delayed fear. She shifted in her chair, and the movement pulled at the bandage on her thumb. Ashmore's head turned at once, attention sharp as if he had been counting every breath she took. "When did you last eat?" he asked. The question struck her more deeply than any accusation had. Lady Whitcomb made a soft sound of irritation. "Your Grace, surely that is irrelevant." He did not look at her. "I did not ask you." Rebecca kept her voice even. "Yesterday at noon." His jaw tightened once. He turned to the door. "Broth, bread, now!" The footman moved. Lady Whitcomb leaned forward, disbelief and anger breaking through the polished mask. "You are feeding her in the middle of my examination." Ashmore faced her then, and for the first time heat entered his voice. Not volume, not loss of control, but unmistakable heat. "You laced her into a borrowed dress until she could not draw breath. You sent her into rain before dawn on an empty stomach. You instructed her to repeat a lie that would have buried her when this ring surfaced. Examination will proceed when she can hold a pen without shaking." Rebecca felt the room shift around that line. No one spoke. Even Lady Whitcomb seemed startled by the naked precision of his observations. He had not merely listened to statements. He had watched. Her shoes, her hands, the strain at her ribs, the hunger she had hidden by habit. He had stored each detail and named it aloud where witnesses could hear. The tray came quickly. Plain broth, coarse bread, a cup of tea. The servant set it near Rebecca with lowered eyes, and withdrew. She stared at the bowl for one moment too long. Eating in this room, under this gaze, felt like exposure of another kind. Ashmore read the hesitation and gave a single instruction. "Take it!" She obeyed. Warmth hit her mouth and throat and settled, painful, into an empty stomach. Her hands steadied by degrees. She kept her eyes on the bowl, aware of him still standing, still not taking his seat, as if any relaxation of posture might give Lady Whitcomb an opening. The stillness itself became the crack, the thing no one in that room could mistake. He was a duke, accustomed to command from distance, yet he remained within arm's reach of a woman who had arrived soaked and voiceless at his threshold, and he did not step away. By the time St. Paul's bells marked the half-hour, the statements were signed and sanded. Mr. Hale stacked them in strict order. Rebecca first, then Edith, then Pritchard, then Lady Whitcomb's amended declaration with corrections initialled in a cramped, angry hand. Ashmore tied the packet himself and sealed it with his signet before passing it to the butler. "To Barrister Kett directly," he said. "No intermediary." "Yes, Your Grace." He then unwrapped the ring. The black funeral ribbon slid loose across his palm like a narrow shadow. The sapphire caught the thin noon light and held it. He looked at it for a long beat, then at Lady Whitcomb. "You purchased this from Greaves and Son, Holborn, 6 days after Lady Clara's effects were inventoried," he said. "Your payment appears in your own household journal under miscellaneous mourning trims." Miss Fraser's father's coded account book, recovered this morning, contains the matching transfer notation in margin script he used for cross-ledger verification. "You assumed no one left in your house could read his cipher." Rebecca's breath caught. She had not known he had found the journal already, or that he had read enough to use it as a blade. Lady Whitcomb rose so quickly her chair tipped and struck the carpet. "You searched private family property without warrant." He didn't move. "You concealed evidence in my fiancé's wedding dress." "I protected my household." "You protected yourself." Her voice shook now despite all effort. "You would destroy a woman over one ring." His answer came without pause. "Over coercion, fraud, tampering of evidence, and calculated reputational harm against a woman under your authority." He set the ring down on the table between them, then placed his hand over it again. Final. "You will not approach Miss Fraser again without my express leave. You will not issue orders to her staff contacts. You will not dismiss, dock, threaten or relocate any servant named in today's record. Violate one condition and I petition immediate magistrate intervention before sunset." Lady Whitcomb stared at him, then at Rebecca, and the hatred in that glance was stripped of ornament at last. "You think this makes her your equal," Ashmore answered with brutal calm. "No, it makes her protected." He turned to Rebecca. The room narrowed to that axis. His face and hers, the table, the wrapped packet gone, the ring under his hand. His tone dropped, quiet and absolute. "You will gather your books from this house now," he said. "Only what is yours. Mr. Hale will inventory each volume. You will leave under Ashmore escort. You will not sleep another night under this roof." Rebecca set the spoon down very carefully. Her pulse hammered against the base of her throat. "My lord, the contracts are not yet signed. They will be revised and signed in my library, not here. If I refuse—" His eyes held hers. Winter water grey. No softness. No retreat. "Then you refuse with full knowledge and full shelter elsewhere, not under coercion, not hungry, not cornered." The words were an irrevocable offering and an irrevocable indictment of every day that had led to this room. She felt something inside her shift, not surrender, not trust yet, but the first fracture in the old certainty that endurance was the only tool she would ever be allowed. From the hall came the muted tread of additional boots and the low murmur of male voices announcing arrival at the front door. Barrister Kett, perhaps. Perhaps more. Ashmore did not look away. "Finish the broth," he said, the command almost harsh in its restraint. "Then show Mr. Hale which shelves are yours." He remained where he was while she lifted the bowl again. a broad-shouldered wall between her and Lady Whitcomb, and he did not move even when the voices in the hall rose and the next phase of ruin knocked at the house, and he did not move even when the voices in the hall rose and the next phase of ruin knocked at the house. Mr. Hale opened the music-room door to Barrister Kett first, a spare man with iron-grey hair and rain at the hem of his coat, then to a magistrate's clerk carrying a leather case, and finally to 2 uniformed officers who remained in the corridor with their hats in hand and their faces deliberately blank. Lady Whitcomb gave a small, incredulous laugh when she saw them, as if legal process were an impolite guest she could refuse at the threshold. Ashmore did not turn. "You are in time," he said to Kett. "Statements are sealed. Evidence is present. We proceed now." Kett's eyes moved from the tied packet to the unwrapped ring and black ribbon, then to Rebecca, still pale from hunger and strain, shawl drawn close over the torn bodice. He bowed to her with grave correctness, and the simple courtesy struck harder than any dramatic gesture. "Miss Fraser," Lady Whitcomb recovered enough to speak over him, "you will not conduct theatre in my house." Kett set his case on the table and withdrew fresh paper, sealing wax, a narrow brass scale, and a small magnifying glass. "Madam, this ceases to be your private matter when coercion and fraudulent transfer are documented in witness sequence." He looked to Ashmore. "I require chain of custody stated aloud." Ashmore answered, without hesitation, "Ring recovered from left bodice channel at Bellier fitting rooms before witnesses. Received into my hand directly from Madame Bellier. Brought without interruption to Ashmore House, then Whitcomb residence. Ribbon remained attached until unwrapped in this room. Statements were taken in order and signed." Kett nodded and marked each line. The clerk copied. The scale balanced the ring and recorded its weight. The magnifying glass confirmed the inscription inside the band, CB, and the date. Rebecca watched the tiny movements and understood, with a cold clarity, that truth needed ritual to survive power. One spoken sentence vanished. Ink with witnesses endured. When Kett asked for the father's coded journal, Ashmore signalled to a footman, who produced it from a locked dispatch box brought in from the hall. Rebecca recognised the cracked brown leather and the ink smudge at the lower corner where her father had once blotted too quickly. Her throat tightened. Ashmore placed the journal before her, not Kett. "Can you read the cipher lines aloud for record?" he said. She laid her bandaged thumb against the page edge to steady her hand and read the entry linked to Greaves and Son, Holborn, 6 days after Clara Bellamy's effects were inventoried. The margin notation in her father's compact script cross-referenced a private outlay paid through Whitcomb household columns and disguised as mourning trim. Her voice shook once and then steadied. Kett requested the matching Whitcomb ledger. It was produced, opened, and compared line by line under the clerk's eye. By late afternoon, rain had thinned to mist, and the room smelled of damp wool, hot sealing wax, and lavender turning sour in the heat. Edith and Pritchard were recalled and affirmed their statements in Kett's presence. Neither embellished, neither withdrew. The loaded look Lady Whitcomb had given Edith was entered as attempted pressure and answered in plain words by the maid herself. "Her ladyship looked at me as she does before wages are cut." Kett wrote it down without expression. When all testimony was complete, the magistrate's clerk rose. "On preliminary review, I issue immediate protective instruction pending formal hearing. Lady Whitcomb is not to interfere with Miss Fraser's person, property, correspondence, or named witnesses. Household papers, relevant to financial coercion, are to be surrendered for audit." Lady Whitcomb stood so quickly that her chair scraped harshly over wood. You are exiling me from my own rooms on the word of servants and a half-starved girl." The clerk did not flinch. "Madam, you may retain temporary residence under supervision until departure arrangements are fixed. You may not direct this household. You may not contact Miss Fraser, except through counsel." Ashmore added, quiet and final, "You will depart London Society's district addresses by week's end. Kett will file the notice tonight." Her eyes burned toward Rebecca with naked blame. "He will tire of your righteousness." Rebecca met her gaze and found to her own surprise that fear had changed shape. "Then I will still have my name." Mr. Hale inclined his head toward Rebecca. "Miss Fraser, if you wish, we may collect your volumes now." She wished. She rose. The library cabinet key was in Lady Whitcomb's reticule, and for one suspended second no one moved. Then Kett held out his hand. "Madam!" She did not surrender it until one officer stepped fully into the doorway. The key came free at last with a soft metallic sound that seemed larger than it was. Rebecca followed Mr. Hale to the former schoolroom cabinet, and then to the old library alcove, where displaced books had been stacked too deep behind newer bindings. Each volume was checked against her father's pencilled marks and entered on Hale's inventory sheet. Milton, Blackstone, river surveys, tenant maps, 2 poetry books with cracked spines, a slim atlas with her initials in faded ink. She found the silver-backed brush set missing, the cameo gone, her mother's letters never returned. Hale noted them as absent property. "Not recovered," he wrote beside each line. As dusk gathered, trunks were packed in the front hall under Ashmore escort. Books wrapped in linen, the coded journal in a locked case, the belly address sealed in brown paper as evidence with the torn seam tagged and signed, and Lady Whitcomb's morning note placed with the statements. Every object that had cut, accused, or concealed was named and accounted for before it crossed the threshold. The next morning opened cold and clear, with a hard blue light over Chapelstone, and no rain at all. Rebecca stood in a plain cream gown, cut to fit her own body, breathing easily for the first time in days. There were no crowded pews, no gossiping gallery, no orchestra purchased for display. Kett stood near the vestry table with revised contracts, Mr. Hale beside him, and 2 tenant trustees from the lower riverlands, waiting in their best coats, hats held against their chests, solemn as men entering court. Before the service began, Ashmore asked for a private minute in the small antechamber off the nave. He closed the door. The quiet between them was not gentle, but it was honest. He opened his palm. The sapphire ring lay there, cleaned now, the black ribbon folded beside it like a shadow finely given edges. "Choose." She looked at the ring, then at him. His face was carved back into composure, but his right hand, the one beneath the ring, held too still. She understood then what he was offering and what he feared, not refusal of marriage only, but erasure of Clara and repetition of harm under a new name. Rebecca spoke carefully. "Lady Clara should not be used against either of us again." He waited. "Set this into a memorial locket, keep the inscription. Let it be honoured, not worn as a test." Her pulse struck hard at her throat. "If you wish to marry me without borrowed ghosts at my hand." Something in his shoulders shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a lock easing open after long strain. He closed his fingers around the ring and gave one short nod. "Done?" In the chapel, vows were spoken in clear voices that did not tremble. The contract revisions were signed immediately afterward on the vestry table, while wax cooled in pale circles. Rebecca read every line before placing her name. Her restored settlement could not be seized for household debt. Her father's lower river lands, still legally entangled, were transferred into a tenant trust overseen by 2 local stewards and audited annually by independent clerk. Martha and Tom were retained with full wages under Ashmore House reference. Edith and Pritchard received written protection and placement options. Kett sanded the final signature, looked up once, and said, "Recorded." 3 days later, under magistrate order, Lady Whitcomb departed for her sister's holding in Bath with limited funds, supervised inventory, and no access to Fraser accounts pending full hearing. She did not look back from the carriage window. The loaded look she had given Rebecca in the music room was thus answered by law, and by distance, and by the plain fact that her commands no longer moved anyone in that house. By the 2nd week of November, the memorial locket arrived from Ashmore's jeweller, oval gold, modest, lined in dark blue enamel. The sapphire sat at its centre under glass, inscription preserved on a hinged inner plate with Clara Bellamy's full name engraved beneath. Ashmore placed it in Rebecca's palm in the library with no speech prepared. She fastened it herself and felt its weight settle near her heartbeat, not as claim, but as record. That evening, as light thinned over the long windows of Ashmore House, she stood on a small ladder shelving recovered books in the library that had once been closed to her kind of life. Mr. Hale had left the inventory open on the side table for her final check. Every listed volume was present except those marked not recovered. She drew a line beneath the last entry and wrote, in her precise hand, "Received in full save noted absences." When she stepped down, Ashmore was in the doorway, unmoving. He had been there long enough for the fire to settle and the room to fall into that deep, quiet, large houses rarely allowed. He watched her place her father's journal on the shelf, at eye level, within reach, no key required. His face remained composed, but the rigid line through his shoulders softened by a degree that would have escaped anyone not trained by hardship to read small mercies as landmarks. "You are cold," he said at last. "Come to the fire." It was a command. It was care in the only language he trusted. Rebecca crossed the room and stood beside him, close enough to feel the winter chill leaving his coat, close enough that silence no longer felt like threat. Outside, London moved through dusk without them. Inside, her books stood in ordered rows, her name entered in law, and the house that had begun as transaction held at last a place she did not have to earn by disappearing.